The day Benjamin Yates buried his mother, he walked back to the ranch house, closed the door to her kitchen, and did not open it again for 14 months. It was the autumn of 1874 when Effie Blackwell arrived in Caldwell, Kansas, and everything about her arrival was the kind of thing that people in small frontier towns talked about for years afterward. She came in on the southbound stage from Wichita, which was already late by 3 hours on account of a blown wheel outside of Harper, and she stepped down onto the dusty Main Street with one carpet bag, a hat box, and the kind of squared-up jaw that suggested she had not traveled all this way to be told no. Caldwell was a cattle town in every sense. It sat right along the Kisham Trail, and the air in the fall still carried the last of the season's dust from the drives, that particular smell of cattle and sweat and prairie wind that never fully left the nostrils of anyone who lived there long enough. The storefronts along the main drag were weathered wood, the saloon never closed before 3 in the morning, and the marshal was a decent man named Harold Prout, who did his best but was generally outnumbered. Effie Blackwell was 24 years old, with brown hair the color of creek mud in the late afternoon sun and eyes that were an unsettling shade of green, the kind of green that didn't quite fit the dryness of Kansas but seemed to belong to it anyway. She was not beautiful in the way that paintings were beautiful. She was beautiful in the way that a well-made thing is beautiful, purposeful, and clean-lined, and exactly right for what it was meant to do. She had come from Ohio. She had left behind a father who gambled and a town that knew about it, and she had answered an advertisement posted in the Wichita Daily Eagle by a man named Benjamin Yates who needed a cook and housekeeper for a cattle ranch 12 miles south of Caldwell. The advertisement had been precise and unsentimental. Room and board provided, wage negotiable, experience required, references preferred. Effie had references. She had cooked in a boarding house in Columbus for 3 years, and the woman who ran it had written her a letter that called her industrious, reliable, and the best hand with cornbread in the state of Ohio. Effie had folded that letter into the inside pocket of her carpet bag where she kept the things she considered essential. She had written to the address provided. Benjamin Yates had written back, a short letter in a cramped but careful hand, confirming the position and providing directions to the ranch from Caldwell. The letter was functional to the point of being almost rude, but there was something in the careful formation of the letters, the way certain words were pressed harder into the page than others, that made Effie curious about the man who had written it. She arranged for a hired man in Caldwell named Decker Foss to take her out to the Yates ranch with his wagon, since she had no horse and the carpetbag was manageable but the hatbox was not. Decker Foss was a leathery man of about 50 who drove his wagon like someone was racing him for something, and he talked the entire 12 miles about the weather, the cattle prices, the state of the Kisham Trail now that the buffalo were mostly gone, and eventually about Benjamin Yates. "Decent man," Decker said, in a tone that suggested decency was the best thing he was prepared to say. "Took over his father's spread when old Clarence passed. That's been 6, 7 years now. Then his mama passed on last spring. Woman by the name of Ruth Yates. Everybody knew Ruth. Made the best apple preserves in Sumner County." He paused. "Benjamin ain't been quite himself since. Closed up some. Keeps to the cattle and the hands. Place needs a woman's touch, I can tell you that much." Effie looked out at the flat Kansas landscape, at the golden grass that stretched to every horizon under a sky that was the particular blue of late October, that clean cold blue that came in when summer finally surrendered. "How old is Mr. Yates?" she asked. "Oh, 28, 9, somewhere in there. Young to be running a spread that size by himself, but he manages it. He's got 3 hands that stay on year-round and picks up more during drive season." Decker glanced at her sideways. "You ain't worried he's some kind of dangerous type? Are you telling me he is?" No. Benjamin Yates is about as dangerous as a fence post. What I mean to say is, some young women have certain concerns about taking a position in a house with a bachelor." "I have my own concerns," Effie said, but I prefer to form opinions from evidence rather than from worry. I'll make up my mind when I see the man and the place." Decker seemed satisfied with that, and they rode in companionable silence the rest of the way. The Yates ranch revealed itself gradually. First a windmill turning slowly against that cold blue sky. Then a fence line, well-maintained, which struck Effie as significant because men who let their fences go were usually men who let other things go too. Then the outbuildings, a barn and a bunkhouse and a smokehouse, all of them solid and practical. Then the house itself. It was not a small house. It was 2 stories of unpainted wood that had weathered to a silvery gray, with a covered porch running along the front and a kitchen wing added on the south side. The yard around it was mostly dirt, but someone had once planted rose bushes along the porch railing, and even in October the canes were there, cut back but alive. Benjamin Yates was standing in the yard when the wagon pulled in. Effie's first impression was of height. He was tall, well over 6 feet, with broad shoulders and the kind of lean, hardened build that came from years of actual physical work rather than any particular attention to it. He had dark brown hair that needed cutting and a jaw that carried a few days of beard, not out of style, but out of inattention. His clothes were clean enough but worn. He held his hat in his hands, which she thought was a courtesy she had not expected. His eyes, when he looked at her directly, were the dark gray of storm clouds, and there was something in them that she could not quite name right away. It was only later, lying awake in the small upstairs room he showed her to that first evening, that she identified it. It was grief, not the fresh kind that wept and trembled, the settled-in kind, the kind that had taken up residence and rearranged the furniture. "Miss Blackwell," he said, and his voice was deeper than she had expected, with a careful quality to it, like a man who had learned to weigh his words before setting them loose. "Mr. Yates," she said. She stepped down from the wagon with her carpetbag before Decker could help her, because she preferred to manage her own descents. They stood looking at each other for a moment that was not quite awkward and not quite comfortable. "I'll show you the house," he said. He paid Decker Foss without ceremony and led Effie up the porch steps and inside. The house smelled of wood smoke and leather, and a faint undertone of something she could not immediately identify, something that was not unpleasant but was somehow sad. He showed her the parlor, which had a good fireplace and furniture that had once been fine and was now simply solid. He showed her the upstairs room that would be hers, which was small but clean and had a window that faced east. He did not show her the kitchen. She noticed this. She did not comment on it. He told her she would take her meals with him in the dining room. He told her that the 3 hands, whose names were Cal, Dobb, and Forrest, ate in the bunkhouse and she would take their meals to them unless weather prevented it. He told her that he rose at 5 and expected breakfast at 6. He told her the wage, which was fair. He asked if she had any questions. "The kitchen," she said. "I'll need to familiarize myself with the supplies and the stove." Something moved across his face, quick as a shadow from a passing cloud. "In the morning," he said. "I'll show you in the morning." That first night she cooked supper in the kitchen of the bunkhouse with Cal, who was a wiry young man of about 20 with a cheerful face, showing her where things were and explaining the situation in that straightforward way that men of the frontier often had when they decided someone deserved plain talk. "Boss man's kitchen is off," Cal said, matter-of-factly, not unkindly. "His mama did the cooking in there. He's kept it closed since the funeral, hasn't let anyone in." "How long?" Effie asked. "Better part of a year, coming up on 14 months. Cal watched her face. "He's a good man, Miss Blackwell. He just ain't healed up from losing her yet. She was all he had left." Effie absorbed this and did not speak again until the cornbread was in the pan. In the morning, Benjamin Yates came to the kitchen door and opened it. He stood in the doorway with one hand on the frame, and Effie understood immediately that this was not a small thing. She could see it in the way he stood, not quite entering, not quite retreating, like a man at the edge of cold water who had made the decision to go in but had not yet taken the step. She could see it in the line of his jaw, set hard, and in the careful blankness of his eyes that she was already learning meant the opposite of blankness. She did not make a fuss about it. She came to stand beside him and looked into the kitchen with him, letting him have whatever this moment was without intruding on it. The kitchen was a good one. A large iron cookstove dominated one wall, solid and well-made. There was a long worktable of heavy pine worn smooth with use. Copper pots hung from iron hooks. The shelves held preserved goods, rows of them, the last things Ruth Yates had put up before she died, her handwriting on the labels still legible in the clear October light. Effie looked at Benjamin's profile and saw that he was looking at those labels. "I'll take good care of it," she said quietly. He didn't answer for a long moment. Then he stepped back from the doorway, clearing it for her. And that was all, that was everything. That was his permission and his grief and his trust offered in a single wordless gesture. She stepped into the kitchen of Ruth Yates. She did not rearrange anything that first day. She simply learned where things were, built up the fire in the stove, and cooked. She made biscuits and fried salt pork and coffee that was strong enough to stand a spoon in. She made a pot of bean soup for the midday meal. She made roast beef and potatoes and a dried apple pie for supper, because she had found dried apples in the larder, and she had a feeling about the pie. Benjamin Yates ate his supper at the long dining room table alone, as had apparently been his habit for 14 months, and Effie brought the food out and set it before him and started to go back to the kitchen. "Sit down," he said. She stopped. "I beg your pardon." He looked up at her, and there was something almost apologetic in it, though he didn't seem like a man who apologized easily. "I mean to say, you can eat in here if you'd rather not eat in the kitchen alone." "I don't mind eating alone," she said truthfully. "Neither do I," he said, which was clearly a lie. She sat down. They ate mostly in silence, but it was not the hostile kind. It was the kind of silence that two people fall into when they are both paying attention to each other without wanting to be caught at it. He ate the pie without comment, but he ate 3 slices, and when she cleared the table and was carrying the dishes back to the kitchen, she heard him say, so quietly she almost missed it, "She made dried apple pie." She paused in the doorway but did not turn around. "I know," she said. "I found her recipe card." She heard him breathe. She went to the kitchen and washed the dishes. The days settled into a rhythm. November came in cold and sharp, with the first hints of the winter that would arrive properly in December. Effie rose before 5, had the stove going and coffee on before Benjamin came down. She cooked 3 meals a day, kept the house clean, mended what needed mending, and slowly began to understand the particular shape of the life that happened in this house. Benjamin worked from before dawn until after dark most days. He was not unfriendly, but he was not warm. He had a directness that she respected, a tendency to say exactly what he meant in the fewest words possible, and when he had nothing to say, he said nothing, which was rarer than it should have been among men she had known. He was considerate in the ways that mattered, things like chopping extra wood and leaving it on the kitchen porch without being asked, or fixing the latch on her bedroom window that was letting in the cold, again without being asked. She began to learn the kitchen, not imposing herself on it, but learning it the way you learn a new language, slowly, respectfully, paying attention to the logic of how things were arranged and the reasons behind it. Ruth Yates had been an organized woman. Everything had its place, and the places made sense. Effie came to feel a kind of kinship with the woman she had never met, a woman she knew only through copper pots and labeled jars, and a handwriting that slanted left as though leaning into the wind. In November, a cold snap hit hard, the kind that came down from the north without warning and froze the water in the troughs overnight. Cal came up to the house looking chilled through, and Effie made him sit at the kitchen table and fed him hot coffee and the last of the morning's biscuits, and he looked at her with the frank gratitude of a young man who was not used to being fussed over. Benjamin came in from the barn an hour later and found Cal still at the kitchen table, now talking to Effie about his family in Missouri, and he stopped in the doorway of the kitchen and looked at the scene with an expression that was difficult to read. Cal jumped up and made his excuses and headed back to the bunkhouse. He was cold, Effie said, not defensively, just as information. I know, Benjamin said. He stood in the kitchen for a moment, which was still not something he did easily, still carried the quality of a man standing in water that was deeper than comfortable. Then he went to the stove and poured himself a cup of coffee and stood there drinking it, looking out the small kitchen window at the frozen yard. Effie went on peeling potatoes. You don't have to stay in the kitchen, he said eventually. You can sit in the parlor when your work is done. I like the kitchen, she said. He looked at her. Why? She considered this seriously. Because it's honest, she said. What happens in a kitchen is what it is. You put in effort and care and you get something real out of it. There's no pretense to cooking. Either the biscuits rise or they don't. He stood with his coffee cup and looked at her with those storm-gray eyes, and she had the feeling that she had said something he was going to keep turning over in his mind the way you keep a smooth stone in your pocket. That night at supper he asked her about Ohio. It surprised her, not unpleasantly. He had not asked her anything personal before. She told him about Columbus, about the boarding house, about the Ohio River in summer, and the way the city was growing faster than anyone seemed to be able to make sense of. He listened in the way he did everything, with complete, unhurried attention. Why did you leave? He asked. She looked at her plate and then looked up at him because she had decided early on that she was not going to be dishonest with this man. My father is a gambling man, not a good one. When you're known as the daughter of a bad gambler in a mid-sized city, certain doors close to you, I thought it better to go somewhere I could make myself from the beginning. He absorbed this without judgment. What does making yourself from the beginning look like? I'm not entirely sure yet, she said. I'll know it when I see it. The corner of his mouth moved, which she was coming to understand was as close to a smile as he got in November. What about you? She asked, because fairness demanded it. He was quiet for a moment. This ranch, he said, that's what I'm making myself into. What my father made and my grandfather before him, it's what I have and it's what I am and I'm trying to do right by it. Do you have any family left? No, he said, simple, final. My father died when I was 22. Mother passed last September. She did not say she was sorry because she had already said that in her own way in the kitchen with the dried apple pie and the careful way she handled his mother's copper pots. She thought he understood that. I have the hands, he said. Cal and Dobb and Forrest, they're good men. She nodded. They are, she agreed. December arrived. The ranch went about the particular business of a cattle operation in winter, the checking of fences, the supplemental feeding, the constant vigilance about water sources freezing. Effie kept the house warm and the food good and the larder well managed, and she began to plant small claims on the kitchen that she recognized as her own, not replacing what Ruth had been but adding to it. A jar of her own dried herbs here, a particular method for the beans there. She wrote letters to a friend named Clara back in Ohio, and in those letters she found herself spending more time describing Benjamin Yates than she meant to. Clara, who was sharp, wrote back asking whether the employer was very good-looking, as there seemed to be rather a lot of him in the letters. Effie wrote back that he was perfectly fine-looking in a functional sort of way, and that this was beside the point. She put the letter in the post and then sat in the kitchen for a long time after, listening to the wind outside and the particular silence of the house around her, and thinking about the way he stood in the kitchen doorway that first morning. One evening in December, she was in the parlor with her mending when he came in from a late check on the cattle. He was cold through, she could see it in the set of his face, and she went to the kitchen and came back with coffee and the last of a ginger cake she had made that afternoon, and she set it on the small table by his chair without comment and went back to her mending. He ate the cake and drank the coffee, and she could feel him watching her over the rim of his cup with those steady gray eyes. Effie, he said, and it was the first time he had used her given name. She looked up. Thank you, he said, for the kitchen. For what you've done with it. It was not a casual remark. He had been working up to it, she could tell, in the way he did things carefully, making sure the weight of it was right before he set it down. "Thank you for letting me into it," she said. They looked at each other across the room, and there was something in that look that was more than an employer and an employee exchanging pleasantries, more than two people sitting out a winter evening. There was something personal and tender in it that neither of them moved to name, which was the right thing to do because it was December and they had known each other less than 2 months and they were both careful people. But it was there. Effie felt it in the warmth that went up the back of her neck and had nothing to do with the fire in the parlor hearth. Christmas came. She made a proper Christmas dinner, roast pork and sweet potatoes and 2 kinds of pie, and she invited Cal and Dob and Forrest to come to the house to eat it, since it seemed to her that Christmas should not be eaten in pieces across 2 buildings. Benjamin agreed to this without much discussion, which told her he had been thinking the same thing and waiting for someone to say it. They ate around the big dining room table, all 5 of them, and there was talking and laughing, and Dob, who turned out to have a gift for mimicry, did impressions of various cattle buyers that had them all near tears. Benjamin laughed. It was a real laugh, unguarded, the kind that transforms a face, and Effie watched it happen and felt something shift in the region of her chest. After, when the hands had gone back to the bunkhouse and she was washing the dishes, Benjamin came into the kitchen. He came all the way in this time without the hovering in the doorway, and he picked up a cloth and began drying the dishes she was washing. She did not comment on this. She handed him a plate. "Merry Christmas," he said. "Merry Christmas, Mr. Yates." "Benjamin," he said. She looked at him sideways. He was looking at the plate he was drying with great attention, as though it required significant focus. "Benjamin," she said. The new year came in cold and windy, 1875 arriving across the Kansas plains with none of the ceremony the occasion might have warranted. The cattle were doing well. The ranch ran with the particular efficiency of a well-run operation, and Effie found herself drawn into it more than her job strictly required, asking questions about the cattle and the land and the way a working ranch operated, because she was genuinely curious, and also because, when she asked Benjamin questions, he talked in ways he didn't talk otherwise, animated and specific and clearly in love with what he was doing. He showed her the breeding records he kept in a careful ledger, all the lineage of his cattle tracked back through his father's time and his grandfather's. He showed her the maps of the grazing land. He explained the economics of the trail drives and why the railheads at Abilene and Wichita mattered the way they did. She understood more than he expected her to, and when she said something particularly apt about the relationship between grass quality and beef weight, he looked at her with an expression that was the closest thing to delight she had seen on his face. In January, there was a bad storm, 3 days of it, the kind that came down hard and flat across the Kansas plains and made the world into a white nothing. The hands couldn't get to the house, and Effie and Benjamin were alone in it for 3 days. She was not afraid. She had known worse winters in Ohio, and she trusted the quality of the house and the woodpile, which was substantial. Benjamin was calm in the way that men are calm who have been through bad weather before and know what it requires of them. He spent the daylight hours managing what could be managed about the stock, and came in cold and snow-covered in the evenings. She kept the stove going and the food coming, and on the first evening of the storm they sat in the parlor after supper, and he read aloud from a book of Western history that had been his father's, a thing she had not expected from him, and that moved her for reasons she couldn't quite articulate. His voice was good for reading, steady and clear, and she sat with her mending in her lap and looked at him in the firelight more than she looked at her work. On the second evening of the storm he asked her if she played cards. She did. They played for matchsticks, which was ridiculous and also somehow exactly right. She beat him twice at 7-card draw, and the third time he caught her at it she could see him suppressing a smile with great effort. "You're a good card player," he said. "The boarding house in Columbus attracted a certain type of traveler," she said. "You learned to hold your own." He looked at her across the table at the lamplight on her brown hair, and something in his expression was open in a way she had not seen before. The careful, closed quality of his face, relaxed by the fire and the storm and 3 evenings of just the two of them in a house that was becoming familiar in the particular intimate way that shared space becomes familiar over time. "Effie," he said and stopped. "Yes." "Nothing." He looked at his cards. "Your deal." But she had seen what was in his face before he looked away, and she found she could not look directly at it because it was too much like looking at the sun, not painful but overwhelming, the kind of brightness that required you to look somewhere else for a moment. She dealt the cards. On the 3rd evening, the storm showed signs of breaking, and they sat by the fire with cups of coffee, and he asked her about what she wanted. Not from the position, but from life in the larger sense. It was a serious question, and she gave it the serious answer it deserved. "I want to belong somewhere," she said. "I want to be in a place that is mine and do work that matters. I want to know that what I've made amounts to something real." He looked at her for a long time. "Is it foolish of me to hope that might be possible here?" She understood that he was not talking about employment. She looked down at her coffee cup and then back up at him, and she was aware that this was one of those moments that tipped one way or the other and you didn't get to reconsider afterward. "No," she said. "I don't think it's foolish." He did not kiss her. He was too careful a man for that, and they both knew that something as significant as what was happening between them needed to be handled with the proper respect. But he reached across the space between their chairs and put his hand over hers where it rested on the arm, and they sat like that for a while, watching the fire, while the storm outside began its retreat. February was the month that everything became clear. He started finding reasons to come into the kitchen at times that had nothing to do with meals. He'd come in for coffee, ostensibly, but would stay to talk. He'd come to fix a loose hinge on the cabinet, something that could have been done in 5 minutes, but took considerably longer because of the conversation that happened while it was being done. He started calling her Effie as a matter of course, and the way he said it had a quality to it that she was fairly certain he wasn't aware of, a softness that his voice didn't have when he was being practical. She was falling in love with him. She had the good sense to recognize it and the sense not to panic about it. Benjamin Yates was a good man, a man who had experienced real grief and come through it without bitterness, who ran his operation with fairness and care, who read history books by firelight and dried dishes, and had kept his mother's kitchen like a shrine because he didn't know how to grieve except through reverence. She was also not blind to the complications. She was an employee in his house, in a position that required a certain kind of trust on both their parts, and she had not come to Kansas to get her heart broken in new scenery. She had come to make something real and lasting, and so she was careful, and she paid attention, and she waited. The waiting was not empty. It was full of the kind of daily accumulation that she suspected was the actual substance of love, not the dramatic declarations but the morning coffee and the evening conversations, and the particular way he looked up when she came into a room, as though a light had been turned on somewhere. In the middle of February, a man came to the ranch who caused the first real trouble. His name was Hector Cole, and he was a land agent from a company out of Topeka that was buying up cattle ranch land in Sumner County to resell to farming operations. He arrived in a buckboard with a leather satchel full of papers and a smooth manner that Effie disliked immediately, the particular smoothness of a man who had learned to substitute polish for honesty. Benjamin received him civilly but not warmly, which was his way, and Effie served coffee in the parlor and listened from the kitchen doorway with no particular shame about it. Cole's proposition was straightforward enough on its surface. He wanted to buy the Yates ranch for what he described as a generous price. The land was valuable, he said, very valuable, particularly with the railhead at Caldwell expanding and land prices in Sumner County rising. Benjamin could take the money and start fresh somewhere else, something newer and more modern. "This isn't a starting fresh kind of place for me," Benjamin said. "This is a 3-generation kind of place." Cole smiled in his smooth way. Everything has a price, Mr. Yates. Not everything, Benjamin said, with a quietness that made Effie in the kitchen doorway feel a complicated rush of feeling. Cole left without his sale, but he left the sort of way that suggested he intended to come back. He made some remarks on his way out through the yard about how certain water rights in the area were being contested and how a man without a lawyer could find himself in an uncomfortable position. That evening, Effie found Benjamin at his desk with his land papers spread around him, and she brought him coffee without being asked and set it down and said, "What does he mean about the water rights?" He looked up at her. "He means he's going to try to make life difficult. There's a creek that runs through the south pasture. There's an old survey dispute about whether the rights are fully mine. My father dealt with it and thought it was settled, but if someone with money decided to contest it legally, it could tie things up. What can you do? I need to get to Caldwell and talk to the lawyer there, Mr. Hennessy. He handled my father's affairs." He rubbed the back of his neck. "I should have gone before now." "Go tomorrow," she said. "I can manage the house." He looked at her, and the look had in it something that was past gratitude and on the other side of it toward something warmer. "You always know what needs doing," he said. "I try to," she said. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said carefully, the way he said things that mattered, "You're the best thing that's happened to this house in a long time, Effie." She felt the heat come up in her face and was grateful for the relatively dim lamplight. "The kitchen needed someone," she said, which was not quite a deflection and not quite an answer. "More than the kitchen," he said. She looked at him and he looked at her, and the moment stretched like pulled taffy, sweet and taut and warm. "I'll make sure there's coffee for when you ride in tomorrow," she said, and went back to the kitchen. And in the kitchen she stood at the worktable with both hands flat on the worn pine surface and breathed carefully for a moment. He went to Caldwell the next day and came back in the late afternoon with a report from the lawyer Hennessy, who confirmed that the water rights were sound, properly recorded and legally clear, and that Cole's insinuations were the kind of legal bluffing that required only good documentation to defeat. He had the documentation. He brought it back in a canvas folder and spread it on the kitchen table while Effie listened, and they talked through the whole situation. And there was something deeply satisfying about the way they were talking, like two people who were already partners trying to work out a problem together. After they had settled the question of Hector Cole to their satisfaction, there was a brief silence, and then Benjamin said, looking at the papers on the table rather than at her, "While I was in town, I spoke to Reverend Callies." She became very still. "Did you?" He asked how the ranch was doing. He paused. "I told him I had a housekeeper. He asked about her, and I found I had a good deal more to say about her than the situation of housekeeper strictly calls for." Effie looked at the side of his face, the clean line of his jaw, the way the lamplight caught the darkness of his hair. "What did you tell him?" she asked. He turned to look at her then, and there was nothing hidden in his face, none of the careful blankness. "The truth," he said, "that I had found something I hadn't expected to find and that I was trying to handle it right." "What does handling it right look like?" she asked, and her voice was remarkably steady given what was happening in her chest. "It looks like asking you properly," he said, "whether you might consider something more permanent, whether what I think is between us is something you feel as well, and whether, if it is, you'd be willing to let me court you in the proper way." She looked at him for a long moment, and he held her gaze with those gray eyes that had been a closed door when she arrived in October and were now open, genuinely and completely open, and what she could see through them was a man who had come through grief and solitude and was reaching toward something real with both hands. "I would," she said. "I would be willing." He let out a slow breath, and she realized he had been holding it, and she felt a smile come to her face that she couldn't have stopped if she'd tried. "Good," he said. He looked back at the papers on the table and then looked back at her, and the corner of his mouth moved into the particular almost smile that she had been collecting since November. "Good." They were not demonstrative people by nature, neither of them, which made the small gestures of the courtship all the more significant for their rarity. He started sitting with her in the parlor in the evenings, not reading to her precisely but reading alongside her, and there was something tremendously comfortable about being in the same room with a person who was at ease in their own silence. He brought her wildflowers when February gave way to March, and the first hardy ones pushed up through the cold ground, and he did this with the self-consciousness of a man who was not entirely sure about the gesture but was committed to making it. She made things for him. Not showy things. A new pair of gloves from the leather she found in the barn, cut and stitched with the neatness that was her natural inclination. An extra blanket for his saddle roll against the cold nights. Honey cake on Sundays, which she came to understand he loved without him ever saying so directly, the way he ate it quietly and carefully as though it deserved reverence. One Sunday afternoon in March, when the first real warmth of spring was hinting itself through the cold, he asked her to walk with him over the south pasture to see the creek. She put on her coat and went with him, and they walked through the brown-gold grass with the wind coming in from the south for the first time in months, carrying that particular promise that Kansas spring had, the smell of distance and new growing things. He showed her the creek, which was running well from the snowmelt, clear and cold over brown stones, and he told her about it in the way he told her everything, specifically and with attention to detail, how his grandfather had first settled the land and why the creek had been essential, how his father had fished it on Sunday afternoons, how he had learned to swim in it as a boy. She listened to all of this and looked at the water moving over the stones and thought about what it meant to have that kind of history in a place. 3 generations of a family in one piece of ground, what it meant to belong to land in that particular continuous way. Her own family had moved twice in her childhood, and before Ohio had been Pennsylvania, and before that had been somewhere in New York that her father had never been precise about. "I never had this," she said, "a place that was just mine." He stood beside her at the creek's edge, close enough that their arms touched, and he said, "I meant what I said about wanting this place to be yours." She looked up at him. "You were talking about the house." "I was talking about everything," he said. In March, she also had a difficult letter from her father. He had debts, significant ones, and he was asking for money with the particular wheedling that she had been receiving letters in this tone since she was 15. She read it alone in her room and then sat with it for a while, feeling the familiar complicated exhaustion of it, the way that family obligation pulled against the life she was building here. She told Benjamin about it that evening. She didn't plan to, but he came into the kitchen and found her at the table with the letter still in her hand, and he asked her directly what was wrong, and she told him. He listened without interrupting, which was typical of him. When she finished, he said, "Do you want to send him something?" "I don't know," she said honestly. "I don't want to encourage a pattern, but I also can't not." "How much would help without encouraging too much?" She named a figure. He went to his desk and came back with the money from the cash he kept there, and he set it on the table in front of her, and when she started to say she couldn't take it from him, he said simply, "Consider it an advance on wages." She looked at him, this man who had known her 5 months and was handing her money for a father who didn't deserve it, doing it because she needed it to be done and he had it to give. "Benjamin," she said. "It's fine," he said. "I'll pay it back. You don't need to." She folded the money carefully and put it with the letter and looked up at him with her throat tight. "I don't know how you became someone I trust this much in 5 months," she said. He sat down across from her at the kitchen table, their kitchen table, and he said, "I started trusting you the morning I let you into the kitchen." She understood what he was saying. That the kitchen was the thing he had protected most carefully and given most completely, and that the giving of it had been the beginning of whatever this was. She reached across the table and put her hand over his, which was the mirror of what he had done in the parlor in January during the storm, and they sat like that for a while in the quiet of the kitchen that smelled of wood smoke and the dried herbs she had hung from the hooks alongside his mother's copper pots. Spring brought the cattle drive preparations, and the ranch transformed itself into a different kind of operation. Benjamin hired 4 additional hands for the season, and the bunkhouse was full and loud, and the yard was constantly busy. Effie scaled up her cooking accordingly, making quantities of food that would have seemed excessive in any other context and were merely adequate here. She was good at it. She was efficient and organized, and she had a way with the men, not flirtatious, nothing like that, but direct and fair and genuinely interested in them as people, which they responded to with the particular loyalty that working men give to people who treat them well. Cal told her one afternoon, while she was loading a meal into the wagon for the pasture crew, that the bunkhouse had never eaten so well in all the years he'd been at the Yates ranch. "Mr. Yates' mother must have been an excellent cook," she said. "She was," Cal said, "but you're different, if you know what I mean. You cook like you care about the people you're cooking for." She thought about this for a while. She thought Ruth Yates had probably cooked the same way, and that perhaps caring for people was something the kitchen both expressed and deepened, the way that doing a thing out of love gradually became something even love hadn't anticipated. The spring drives took Benjamin away for 2 weeks in April. He rode out at the head of a trail drive heading north to the railhead at Wichita, and he was gone for 16 days, and Effie discovered in those 16 days exactly how much of the shape of her daily life had come to include him in it. The house was strange without him. Not empty exactly, because the remaining hands were there, and the work continued, but strange in the way that a song is strange when you remove the melody and leave only the harmony. She kept to the work, kept the house running, wrote to Clara in Ohio, and spent her evenings in the kitchen because the kitchen was where she felt most grounded. She wrote him a letter, which was forward of her and she knew it, but she had been living in a house with him for 6 months and any pretense that they were merely employer and employee had become untenable. She told him the cattle were well. She told him Cal had fixed the fence on the north pasture. She told him she had put up the first batch of spring preserves, the early strawberries that had come in along the creek. She told him at the end of the letter that the house was quieter than it ought to be. He wrote back from Wichita in his careful, cramped hand. He told her the drive had gone well. He told her the cattle had brought a good price. He told her at the end of the letter that he had not expected to think about the house as much as he was thinking about it, and that he thought what he was thinking about was not the house precisely, but a certain person in it. She read that last part 4 times, and then folded the letter into the inside pocket of her apron where she kept things she wanted to keep close. When he rode back in on a Thursday afternoon in late April, she was in the kitchen and she heard the hoofbeats, and she stood up from the stove and she thought, "I am not going to go running out to the yard like a foolish woman." She stayed at the stove and stirred what she was stirring and listened to him come in through the back. He came into the kitchen. He was trail-worn and dusty and needed a shave, and he stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at her the way she had come to love, that direct, open look that said more than he generally put into words. "Welcome back," she said. "Good to be back," he said. He did not move for a moment, and then he crossed the kitchen in 3 strides and he took her face in both his hands, his large, rough hands still dusty from the trail, and he kissed her. It was a careful kiss, the kind of man he was in it, but it was also completely certain, no hesitation about whether it was the right thing, only a certainty about the woman in front of him and what she meant to him. She kissed him back with equal certainty. When they parted, he rested his forehead against hers, and she could smell the trail dust and the horse and the particular smell of him underneath all of it, and she had her hands on his chest and could feel the solid reality of him. "I meant to ask you more formally," he said. "That was formal enough for me," she said. He laughed quietly, and it was the good laugh, the unguarded one that transformed his face. She kept her hands where they were and memorized it. May came in green and warm, the Kansas spring doing what it did briefly before the summer heat took over, and the world around the Yates ranch was the most alive that Effie had seen it. The rose canes on the porch were leafing out, and she asked Benjamin about them, whether they had ever bloomed, and he said yes. His mother had planted them 8 years ago, and they bloomed red in June. "Then I'll see them bloom," she said, which was a statement of intention about her continued presence, and he received it as such. He proposed to her properly on a Sunday afternoon in May, sitting on the porch in the early evening warmth with the smell of the prairie grass coming in on the breeze. He did not get down on a knee because they were both sitting in chairs, and the formality of that particular gesture felt like something from a world that was not theirs. But he was serious and direct and careful in the way he did serious things. And he asked her to marry him, and told her what she meant to him in the quiet but absolutely total way that he expressed things that were important. She said yes before he had finished the sentence, which was unlike her general preference for careful deliberation. But there are moments when the answer is simply already there and waiting to be spoken, and this was one of them. They were married in Caldwell in June, at the small church on the north end of the main street, with Reverend Callies presiding and Cal and Dobb and Forrest standing up as witnesses because they were the closest thing to family either of them had in Kansas. The marshal, Harold Prout, came to the church and sat in the back pew, which touched Effie in a way she hadn't expected. Two of the neighboring ranch wives came, women she had met over the winter in Caldwell, and they brought a covered dish each to the small supper afterward at the ranch house. The roses on the porch were blooming. They were red, a deep true red that was startling against the weathered silver of the house, and when Effie stepped out of the wagon that brought them home from Caldwell and saw the roses in full bloom against the afternoon sky, she put her hand to her mouth. Benjamin stood beside her and looked at the roses, and then looked at her hand over her mouth and her eyes bright with something that was not quite tears, and he put his arm around her and kept it there. "She would have liked you," he said. "Tell me more about her," Effie said. So he did. That afternoon and evening, their first as husband and wife, he told her about Ruth Yates, about the woman who had run this house and raised a son on the Kansas prairie and made apple preserves and planted roses and cooked in that kitchen with the copper pots and the pine worktable for 30 years. He told her stories, and Effie listened to all of them and laughed at the ones that were funny and was quiet for the ones that were not. And in the telling she understood that this was the grief moving through him the way grief eventually does. Not out but through. Not gone but transformed into something that could be carried with gratitude rather than only with weight. That night they ate supper that the ranch hands had prepared in the bunkhouse kitchen while the couple was in Caldwell. A generous and slightly chaotic meal that Forrest, who was the best cook of the three, had apparently orchestrated with some seriousness. They ate with Cal and Dobb and Forrest, and there was toasting with a bottle of whiskey that Cal produced from somewhere, and there was laughter and good feeling, and the particular warmth of people who have made a small and genuine community together. Later, alone in the house, Benjamin took Effie's hands in his at the door to the kitchen and said, "You have made something of this place that I couldn't have made alone." She turned his hands over in hers and looked at them, these working hands, scarred and capable, and she said, "We made something of it." They were well suited. This was the thing that became clearer with every month of the marriage. They were both practical people with a capacity for deep feeling that they expressed through action rather than declaration. They were both honest and fair, and had a shared instinct about what mattered and what didn't. She brought a brightness to the ranch that wasn't frivolous, but was the natural brightness of a woman who was genuinely happy in her life, and he brought to her the solidity and continuity of a man who had built himself into something real and lasting and was glad to share it. The summer was good. The cattle were well, the land was well, and the kitchen was alive in ways it had not been for 14 months before Effie came to it. She put up preserves all through the summer, strawberries and cherries and wild plums and the peaches that came in from a neighbor's small orchard, and the shelves in the kitchen filled up the way Ruth's shelves had been full, with jars of color, ruby and gold and purple, all of them in Effie's handwriting, now alongside the last few jars in Ruth's left slanting script that Effie kept precisely where they were. She also wrote in a recipe book that she found in the kitchen, a blank one, and she put Ruth's recipes in it first, carefully copied from the cards she had found scattered in drawers and tucked into the back of the old cookbook, and then her own recipes after, and she kept the book on the shelf above the stove where it would be close to hand. In the fall there was another round of business with Hector Cole, who had not given up on the land purchase as easily as they had hoped. He sent a letter in September, through a Topeka law firm, making noise again about the water rights. Benjamin went to Caldwell and spent 2 days with the lawyer Hennessy, and came back with documentation so thorough that when Effie read through it, she said the man on the other end of this dispute was either very foolish or running a bluff. Running a bluff, Benjamin confirmed. Hennessy says he's done this to 3 other ranches in the county, 2 of them sold. He's counting on people not having the documentation or the will to fight it. We have both, Effie said. We do, he agreed, and there was something in the way he said we that still, after 4 months of marriage, made her feel the warmth go up the back of her neck. Hennessy sent a formal response to the Topeka law firm, and the Topeka law firm was silent after that. Hector Cole, so the word went in Caldwell when Benjamin went to town in October, had moved his operations north to Sedgwick County. The matter was closed. They celebrated quietly, which was their way, with a good dinner and a bottle of wine that Benjamin had brought back from Caldwell in anticipation, and they sat on the porch after dinner in the cool October air, and watched the stars come out over the prairie in that particular extravagant way they had out here, where there were no city lights to compete with them. 1 year, Effie said, because it was the end of October and she had arrived in Caldwell 1 year ago. Changed my life, he said. She turned to look at him. Mine too. For the better, he said, which was both a statement and a question. For the better, she confirmed, unambiguously and completely. He took her hand where it rested on the arm of her chair, the same gesture he had made that January night during the storm, but easy now where it had been careful then, natural where it had been significant. She turned her hand over and laced her fingers through his. I want to stay here forever, she said. Is that strange? I spent so long wanting to be somewhere else. Not strange, he said. It means you found the right place. In November of 1875, she told him she was with child. He was very still for a moment, the way he was still when something was happening inside him that was too large for immediate expression. She watched his face and saw it move through surprise, and then something that was not quite belief, and then a kind of wonder that she had never seen there before, that she suspected she was the only person who had ever had occasion to put there. He stood up from his chair and came to her and took her face in his hands the same way he had that day he came back from the trail drive, and he kissed her forehead, which was a more tender gesture than she had expected from him and which told her more than anything he might have said. Are you well? He asked. You feel well? I feel very well, she said. A little tired in the mornings, but well. Then I'm glad, he said, and his voice was not quite steady, and she loved him completely in that moment, this careful, quiet man who held his feelings like a man carries water, cupped and careful and trying not to spill a drop. They told Cal and Dobb and Forrest at supper the next Sunday, and the response from the hands was enthusiastic enough that Cal knocked over his coffee cup and Dobb made a speech that was long and somewhat incoherent but clearly sincere. And Forrest, who was the quietest of the 3 and had apparently liked Ruth Yates very much, looked at Effie with an expression that was unambiguously glad. Mrs. Yates, Forrest said, which was still occasionally strange to hear even after 5 months of it, this is good news. This is real good news. Winter came again. Effie's second Kansas winter, but different in every way from the first. She was not a newcomer but a wife, not a question but an answer. The house was hers in the way she had wanted a place to be hers, genuinely and completely, earned through the year of work and care and love that had brought her to this particular December morning in this particular kitchen. She was learning to pace herself with the morning sickness, which was not severe, but was persistent enough to require management. Benjamin had taken to doing the morning coffee himself on the days she was slow to get up, and she would come down to find the kitchen warm and the coffee ready, and he would hand her a cup with a look that was quiet and steady and completely devoted. And she thought that this was perhaps what love looked like in its most essential form. Not the grand gestures, but this: a man who learned to make the coffee. That winter, they spent evenings by the fire with a different quality than the winter before. The first winter had been the winter of two careful people learning each other. This winter was the winter of people who had decided on each other and were now simply living inside that decision, which was fuller and warmer and easier than the deciding had been. He had started talking to the baby, which he thought she didn't know about. She had found him in the kitchen one morning in early December when she came down earlier than usual, standing at the stove with his coffee, speaking quietly and matter-of-factly about the cattle breeding records to a point somewhere in the vicinity of her abdomen. She stood in the doorway and listened, and he heard her and looked up, and the expression on his face was so transparently embarrassed that she had to bite the inside of her cheek. "Carry on," she said. "I was not," he said. "You absolutely were." "The cattle records are important," he said with great dignity. "They are," she agreed. "Please continue." He looked at her for a moment and then said, "To the cattle records, or to the child who might be listening, or to the kitchen at large, she thinks she's very funny." "I know I am," she said, and went to the stove to start breakfast. Christmas of 1875 was the best Christmas the Yates ranch had seen in many years, by the judgment of Cal, who had been there 7 years and had some basis for comparison. Effie cooked a Christmas dinner that was the kind of meal that gets talked about afterward, the kind that people remember not just for the food, but for everything around it, the warmth and the company and the feeling of being exactly where you ought to be. She made Ruth's dried apple pie. She had made it several times now, had perfected her rendering of it, had added it to the recipe book as Ruth's pie, Miss Blackwell's notes, which she had thought was the right way to record it. Benjamin ate 2 slices in silence, and when she looked at him across the table he met her gaze, and there was something in his that was complicated with memory and present happiness. And she thought that grief and joy were not so different in their depth, that they occupied the same space in a person, and that perhaps this was why love helped with loss. The baby came in the first week of July, 1876, on a morning when the heat was already significant by 8 o'clock, and the prairie stretched flat and golden in every direction. The midwife from Caldwell, a capable woman named Mrs. Aldridge, had come out 3 days before in anticipation, and she and Effie had an easy understanding of each other that made the whole business go more smoothly than it might have otherwise. The baby was a boy. He arrived loud and vigorous and furious about it, and Benjamin, who had been sent to wait in the parlor and had apparently spent the time in a state of rigid composure that Cal described later as the most controlled terror he had ever witnessed in a man, came into the bedroom when Mrs. Aldridge came to get him, and stood at the bedside, and looked at the red-faced squalling creature in Effie's arms with an expression that she would remember for the rest of her life. "Hello," he said to the baby, which was exactly the right thing to say. "Benjamin," she said, and waited. He looked at her, and she saw all of it in his face at once, everything that he was and everything they had made together, and the enormity of what was happening in this bedroom on this hot July morning, and he sat down on the edge of the bed and took her hand and held it. They named him Clarence for Benjamin's father. Middle name: Edward, which had been Effie's grandfather's name, the one decent gambler in her family's history, she said, a man who had known when to hold and when to fold and had managed to keep himself housed and fed by virtue of judgment rather than luck. Benjamin said it was a good name for a boy who would need judgment, and Effie said she hoped he would get more of it from his father than was strictly genetic. Little Clarence, who was almost immediately called Claire by everyone on the ranch, was a sunny, observant baby who seemed from the beginning entirely at ease with the fact that there were 5 adults on this ranch who were all, to varying degrees, delighted by him. Cal, in particular, was gone on him in a way that was almost comical, a 21-year-old cowhand who had maintained a very credible pose of rough practicality, right up until the moment he held an infant and completely abandoned it. Effie was back in the kitchen within 2 weeks, which Mrs. Aldridge said was too soon, and which Effie said was fine. Thank you. And what she meant was that the kitchen was where she thought most clearly, and the thinking she was doing just now required clear thought. Benjamin built a small cradle in the kitchen, which he positioned near the warmth of the stove but not too near, and Claire slept in it during the mornings while Effie cooked, and this arrangement suited everyone involved. The fall of 1876 was a good one for the ranch. The cattle prices were up, and Benjamin had made some smart decisions about the breeding program that were paying off in the quality of the steers he was sending north. The water rights dispute was definitively over. The house was in good repair. The larder was full. The rose canes had been cut back in November, but they would bloom again in June. One evening in October, Effie was in the kitchen with Claire asleep in his cradle, and the supper things cleared away, and she was at the worktable writing in the recipe book, adding a new recipe she had worked out for a wild plum jam that was particularly good with the pork they smoked in autumn. Benjamin came into the kitchen in that easy way he had now, the man who had once stood in the doorway unable to enter entirely comfortable in the space, and he stood behind her and looked over her shoulder at the recipe book. "What's new?" he asked. "Plum jam," she said. "Page 43. He looked at the book, at the pages that were half in Ruth's handwriting and half in Effie's, at the progression of them, the conversation between two women across time in a language of recipes and preserves, and the particular wisdom of feeding people well. "She'd be glad," he said. Effie put down her pen and leaned back against him, and he put his arms around her, and they stood like that in the kitchen that smelled of wood smoke and dried herbs and the faint sweet residue of the plum jam, looking at the recipe book and at the sleeping baby and at the copper pots on their hooks and at the labeled jars on the shelves, some in Ruth's handwriting and some in Effie's, the whole history of a kitchen and the women who had worked in it. "I think she would be," Effie said. "I think she'd be glad the kitchen was being used. It's the best thing in the house," he said. "The kitchen, all of it, everything that happens in it." She turned in his arms to look at him, and he was looking at her with those storm-gray eyes that she knew as well as her own now, that she could read as easily as the recipe book. And what she saw in them was the same thing she felt when she looked at him, a love so settled and deep it didn't need to announce itself. It was simply there the way the creek was there, and the prairie was there, and the sky was there, an essential and permanent feature of the landscape. "You are the most unexpectedly sentimental person," she said. "I had help," he said. She smiled at him. He kissed her. In the cradle, Claire stirred but did not wake, and the stove ticked as the fire settled, and outside the kitchen window the October stars were coming out over the Kansas prairie, extravagant and clear. In the spring of 1877, there came to Caldwell a small situation that became for a time rather talked about, and which touched the Yates ranch in a way that Effie thought later was significant in its own right. There was a woman named Pearl Dawes who had come out from Missouri with her husband, who had died of a fever on the trail, and left her stranded in Caldwell with nothing much and no family in the territory. She was a young woman, 20 or so, with a child of about 2, and she was in the position that the frontier was particularly unkind about putting women in, which was to say without resources, and without standing in a place that did not have much use for either if you couldn't support yourself. Effie heard about her from one of the ranch wives in Caldwell when she came in for supplies in March, and she came home and told Benjamin about it and said, "I think we should see if there's something to be done." Benjamin, who had not needed much persuasion, rode into Caldwell with her the following week, and they met Pearl Dawes at the house of the Caldwell marshal's wife, who had been putting her up. Pearl was a quiet woman, clearly exhausted and frightened in the way of someone who has been frightened for long enough that it has become a resting state, and she had the slightly distant look of a person who was trying to plan ahead in a situation where the future was opaque. Effie liked her immediately. There was something honest and undefended about Pearl Dawes. the kind of person who had been through enough that the pretense had been worn off, and what was left was simply the actual person. Benjamin offered her work on the ranch, cleaning and laundry, and some of the outdoor work that had expanded as the operation grew. He offered her and her son a small room in the house that had been used as a storage room and could be converted. He offered a fair wage. He said she was free to leave whenever she chose, and that the situation was what it was and not something else. Pearl looked at him and then at Effie and said, "Why?" Effie said, "Because there's room and there's work and you need both. It's not complicated." It wasn't. Pearl Dawes came to the ranch, and it worked out in the practical, unceremonious way that good things sometimes worked out. Her son, whose name was Henry, was a solemn 2-year-old who fell into a wordless but clearly satisfying friendship with Claire, and Pearl herself was a hardworking woman who was good at the things she was given to do and grateful in a way that was not servile but was genuine. Over the months that followed, Pearl found her footing. She had a gift for animals that became apparent when she started helping with the horses in addition to her other work. And Dob, who was the hand most involved with the horse care, taught her what she needed to know with the patient thoroughness of a man who took the handling of horses seriously and was glad to find someone who took it equally seriously. By the summer of 1877, Dob and Pearl were courting, with the slightly dazed quality of two people who had not planned for it but had arrived at it anyway. And the ranch had the pleasant warmth of a place where people were generally happy in their work and their company. Effie observed all of this from the kitchen with the satisfaction of a woman who believed that decency was not complicated and that it tended to generate its own returns. The summer of 1877 was hot in the way that Kansas summers could be brutal. A heat that sat on the prairie and did not move, that made the cattle slow and the hands short-tempered, and the work harder than it ought to be. Effie managed the kitchen through it with the pragmatism she brought to everything, cooking heavier in the early mornings when it was still cool and keeping the midday meals light, and making sure that the water barrel in the yard was kept full, and that everyone who came to the kitchen door got something cold to drink. Benjamin came in one afternoon in August, genuinely exhausted in a way she didn't often see him, and she took one look at him and sent him to sit on the shaded north porch with cold water and the leftover pie from the morning and strict instructions not to come back inside until he had rested for an hour. He gave her a look that was partly reproachful and partly grateful and entirely fond. "You're very bossy for a woman of your size," he said. "You're very ungrateful for a man who just got pie," she said. He went to the porch. Claire, who was 13 months old and recently and enthusiastically mobile, followed his father to the porch and fell asleep against his knee in the way of toddlers who decide suddenly that sleep is the most urgent possible thing. And Benjamin sat on the north porch in the shade with his son against his knee and the pie half-eaten beside him. And when Effie looked out the kitchen window to check on them, she found them both asleep. She stood at the kitchen window for a moment, looking at her husband and her son on the porch, and felt the particular weight of a happiness that was so solid and real that it seemed impossible that it had come about through a newspaper advertisement in the Wichita Daily Eagle and a letter in a cramped but careful hand. She went back to the stove. In November of 1877, Effie discovered she was expecting again, which was news she delivered to Benjamin over supper with a calm that he saw through immediately. "You're smiling," he said. "I'm not smiling," she said. "You're doing the thing where you think you're not smiling, but you are." "There might be something I need to tell you," she said. He set down his fork and looked at her, and the understanding came into his face, and the look that followed it was the same wonder she had seen the first time, no less for being familiar. "Again," he said. "Again," she confirmed. He came around the table and took her face in his hands, which was his particular gesture for the moments that mattered most to him, and he kissed her with the same certainty he had always kissed her. And she thought that she would never be tired of that certainty, that it was the most reliable thing in her life and one of the best. The second child arrived in July of 1878, another summer baby, and was a girl, which delighted everyone and surprised no one except Benjamin, who had apparently convinced himself it would be another boy, and was consequently so thoroughly undone by the sight of his daughter that he sat in the rocking chair in the bedroom with her for 2 hours while Effie rested and Mrs. Aldridge tidied up, and was found there by Cal, who came to the doorway and took one look at him and said, very quietly, that he was going to go back to the bunkhouse now. They named her Ruth for his mother. Benjamin had suggested it, simply and without preamble, one evening during the winter when they were talking about names, and Effie had looked at him and then looked at the kitchen and said yes, that was exactly right. Little Ruth Yates came into the world in the same kitchen where her grandmother had cooked for 30 years, in the room that Ruth the elder had slept in the house that her great-grandfather had built along the creek that ran through the south pasture, and the continuity of it was something that Effie felt in her bones, the sense of a thread running through time that was strong enough to hold. The ranch in the late 1870s was a flourishing thing. Benjamin's careful management, and the honest hard work of the hands, and the general good luck of a few good weather years had brought the operation to a point of real stability. They were not wealthy in the way that the cattle barons further south were wealthy, but they were solid and self-sufficient and comfortable, which was better than wealthy in the ways that mattered most. Dob and Pearl were married in the spring of 1879, a simple ceremony in Caldwell that Effie helped Pearl dress for, and Henry, who was now 4 and had Claire as his constant companion and best friend, served as a kind of unofficial attendant who took his responsibilities very seriously and was given a piece of ribbon to carry, which he did with great solemnity. The ranch had become something more than a cattle operation. It had become a place where people lived real lives, where there was history and future both present at the same time, where the kitchen at the center of the house was the warmest and best used room, where children played in the yard, and the rose canes bloomed red every June, and the recipe book on the shelf above the stove held the accumulated wisdom of 2 women who had loved this place and the people in it. One evening in the fall of 1879, 5 years after Effie had stepped down from Decker Foss's wagon and looked at a man holding his hat in his hands in a dusty yard, she was in the kitchen with Ruth on her hip and Claire underfoot, and the supper ready and the stove banked for the night, and Benjamin came in and took the baby from her with the ease of a man entirely comfortable with the weight of small children. And they stood together in the kitchen while Claire industriously investigated the lower shelves. "The Millers are selling," Benjamin said. "The ranch east of ours, going back to Indiana. Their youngest is sick and they want to be near family." Effie looked at him. "Are you thinking about buying it? The east pasture would double our grazing, the price is fair." He looked at her over the top of Ruth's head. "It would mean more work for a few years." "We've done more work with less," she said. He smiled. The full smile, not the corner of the mouth one. The real one that she had collected like a prize since December of 1874, each instance of it something she kept. "Yes, we have," he said. "Then let's do it," she said. They bought the Miller land in the spring of 1880, and the Yates ranch grew east along the creek and out into the new pasture, and the additional cattle and the additional hands and the general expansion of everything gave the next several years a productive busy quality that Effie found she loved. She loved the fullness of it. She loved the mornings when the kitchen was alive with the sounds of preparation, the stove crackling and the coffee ready, and the smell of whatever she was baking filling the whole downstairs. She loved the evenings when the day was done, and they sat in the parlor with the children and the hands came and went, and the house had the warm inhabited sound of people at rest. She loved the Sundays when the work was lighter and they walked the land together, she and Benjamin, over the new pasture and along the creek, Claire running ahead and Ruth on Effie's hip and the Kansas sky enormous overhead. In 1881, Cal left the ranch to start his own operation further north, in the territory, which was the natural culmination of 7 years of learning and saving, and he left with Benjamin's full support and a breeding cow that Benjamin gave him as a going-away gift, and that cow looked at with the expression of a man who understood exactly what it meant. The three of them, Cal and Benjamin and Effie, stood in the yard on the morning Cal rode out, and there was the particular feeling that good departures have, the sadness that is also pride, the missing that is also the recognition that the person leaving is ready. "You'll be all right," Benjamin told him. "Yes, sir," Cal said, which he had never said before, which told them both that he felt the weight of the moment. "Come back and see us," Effie said. "Yes, ma'am," he said, and touched his hat to her and rode north. She watched him go from the porch and felt the bitter sweetness of watching the people you've helped become the people they were meant to be. In the kitchen that morning she made Cal's favorite, a cinnamon raisin cake that she had learned he liked in the winter of 1874 when he had sat at her table for biscuits in the cold snap, and she did not tell anyone that was what she was doing. She just made it and put it out at midday in Forest, who knew the significance, looked at the cake and then at Effie and said nothing but looked it. The years moved the way good years move, not without trouble, because there was always trouble of one kind or another. A bad drought year in 1882 that tested everyone. A cattle sickness the following spring that took 20 head before it was contained. A hard winter in 1884 that was the worst in Effie's memory. But through all of it the ranch held, and the family held, and the kitchen continued to be the warmest room in the house. In 1883, Effie had a third child, another boy, who came into the world looking like his grandmother and was named James, for no particular reason except that Benjamin had a cousin James somewhere in Virginia, whose existence he had mentioned once, and whose name seemed to fit the child. 3 children in the house changed the nature of things in all the ways that a third child does, which is to say it made everything louder and funnier and more exhausting and more alive. Claire was 8 and already working alongside his father with the seriousness of a boy who had decided early that ranching was what he was made for. Ruth was 5 and had her grandmother's name and, Benjamin said, her grandmother's way with people, a natural warmth that made everyone around her feel seen. James was a cheerful baby who seemed to have no complaints about the world and investigated everything within his reach with great thoroughness. Pearl and Dobb had added a daughter to their family in 1882, a girl they named Agnes, and Henry was 7 and Agnes was 1, and the bunkhouse end of the ranch had the full busy sound of a place where life was genuinely happening. By 1885, when Effie Yates was 35 years old and Benjamin was 39, the Yates Ranch was one of the best-run operations in Sumner County. The cattle were excellent, the land was well managed, the buildings were sound, and the reputation of the place was what it had taken 3 generations to build, which was a reputation for fairness and quality and the kind of steady decency that makes other people want to do business with you. Effie was known in the county not just as Benjamin's wife, but as her own particular person, the woman who ran that household like a captain ran a ship, who put up the best preserves in the district, who would feed anyone who came to her door and never made it anything other than a natural thing. The recipe book above the stove was full now, front to back, all of it. Ruth's recipes in Ruth's left slanting hand and Effie's in Effie's neat careful script, and at some point Claire had contributed a drawing of a horse that had no particular culinary relevance but was in the book anyway. One autumn evening in October of 1885, 11 years from the October she had arrived, Effie was in the kitchen alone in the early dark. The children were in bed. Benjamin was finishing something in the barn. The stove was banked and warm, and the kitchen had the quiet particular quality it had in the evenings, that particular inhabited peace. She took down the recipe book from its shelf and sat at the work table and opened it. She read through it slowly. Ruth's apple preserves, Ruth's dried apple pie, Ruth's cornbread, and then her own, a dozen years of cooking in this kitchen, biscuits and bean soups and roast beef and plum jam and cinnamon cake and Christmas dinner and the big hot weather meals of summer and the warming meals of winter, all of it in the book. Claire's horse drawing on page 67. Benjamin came in from the barn and found her there, reading the recipe book by lamplight. He stood in the kitchen doorway, and for a moment she could see in him the ghost of the man who had stood in this same doorway 11 years ago, unable to come fully in, holding himself back from the room that held everything he had lost. She could see it, and she could also see how completely that man had been replaced, not erased but transformed, by the years and the living and the love that had happened in this kitchen since then. He came in. He came to the work table and sat down across from her and looked at the book she was reading. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "Your mother," she said, "and how she would have felt about the plum jam on page 43. He considered this. "She would have told you it needed less sugar." "She would have been right," Effie said. He looked at her across the kitchen table and she looked back at him, and what was between them was 11 years of marriage and 3 children and 400 acres of good Kansas land, and a kitchen that had been closed for 14 months and had been open for 11 years since, and all the meals and mornings and evenings and winters and springs that had happened in it. "I love you," he said. He didn't say it often. When he said it, it meant the whole weight of it. She reached across and put her hand over his. "I love you," she said. The stove ticked. Somewhere upstairs Claire turned in his sleep, and the old house settled around its inhabitants. The silver-gray wood that had weathered 3 generations, the porch where the rose canes waited for June, the south pasture where the creek ran clear and cold over brown stones, the whole of it quiet and whole, and exactly as it ought to be. She closed the recipe book and set it back on its shelf above the stove. Outside, the October stars were coming up over the Kansas prairie, extravagant and clear and deeply familiar, the same stars that had come up over this land when Benjamin's grandfather first staked his claim here, the same stars that would come up over Claire and Ruth and James when this land was theirs, the long, unbroken thread of it running through time without end. "Come to bed," Benjamin said. "In a minute," she said. She stood for a moment alone in the kitchen, in the warm, dim room with the lamplight and the smell of wood smoke and the copper pots on their hooks and the labeled jars on the shelves, in the kitchen of Ruth Yates that was also the kitchen of Effie Yates, that was also the kitchen of this house and this family and this particular piece of the world. She ran her hand along the worn pine of the work table, the way she had done 1,000 times. She turned down the lamp. She went upstairs to her husband. And in the morning she would be back in it again before 5, with the stove going and the coffee on and the particular smell of a working kitchen filling the house from its center outward. The whole day beginning the way it always began, with the kitchen alive and warm at the heart of everything, feeding the people she loved. Which was, she had come to understand, not the smallest thing in the world but perhaps the largest, the daily faithful act of nourishment, the work of hands and heat and care, the insistence on gathering people around a table and giving them something real. It was what Ruth Yates had done. It was what Effie Yates did. It would someday be what Ruth the younger did, and the kitchen would still be there for her, copper pots and all ready.